This is the island of Manhattan. The world as we know it passes through here every day. But in another world, a comic book world that closely resembles our own, Manhattan is the home of superhuman defenders of mankind. And first among them are the ones who reside at the Baxter Building, home and headquarters of the greatest adventuring heroes of all time. This series is the story of the comic book that built the Marvel Universe and transformed the medium and the art form around it. We are about to enter the world of the Fantastic Four. Forever Fantastic is a video history of the world's greatest comic magazine. The Fantastic Four is the creation of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and a trademark of Marvel Comics and the Walt Disney Company. If you love the Fantastic Four and the classic history of superhero comics, give this video a like and hit the subscribe button to help the adventures of this channel continue. The Fantastic Four are the original heroes of Marvel Comics. They are the foundation of everything we know as Marvel, and the comic book medium and industry as we know it today would not be anything we would recognize without them. The FF, created in 1961 by writer-editor Stan Lee and artist-storyteller Jack Kirby, was the game changer for comics, Marvel and otherwise. Marvel comic books are set in an imaginary world, modeled after our own. In this world, superpowered heroes are flawed and imperfect. They have real-world problems and can suffer from the same dilemmas as ordinary people. They may have conflicts with each other and the world around them. They have personal vulnerabilities instead of external weaknesses like kryptonite. And that has been a large part of their appeal for more than 60 years. This is where that started. We owe today's standards of superhero storytelling to the comic book whose cover you're looking at right here. If you love Spider-Man, the Avengers, and the X-Men, this is where they came from. The story of the Fantastic Four is the origin of Marvel Comics. At the beginning of the 1960s, the comic book industry was ruled by National Periodical Publications, or DC Comics, the home of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Their greatest competition back in the 1940s, which is called the Golden Age of Comics, was Timely Comics, whose biggest stars were the Human Torch, the Submariner, and Captain America, all of whom had gone out of publication. Timely, which had become Atlas Comics, had fallen on hard times and was using DC's distribution system just to get its comics onto newsstands, and DC imposed strict limits on the number of comics that Atlas could distribute that way. Atlas, which was about to become Marvel Comics, was a struggling, sleepy little company with its publisher, Martin Goodman, and its editor-in-chief and head writer, and Goodman's cousin-in-law, Stan Lee. But something was about to happen at that struggling little company that no one had ever seen before. Something remarkable, something extraordinary, something fantastic. And what happened need not necessarily have happened at all, because at the time of Atlas Comics, Stan Lee was ready to quit comic books. Today, comic books are just respected enough that any decent public library contains a graphic novels section. At the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, comics got no respect at all. None. They were seen as junk entertainment, mainly for children and barely fit even for the attention of kids. Stan Lee, born Stanley Martin Lieber, dreamed of writing the great American novel and was saving his real name for his serious, important work. But Stan was pushing 40 years old and had been writing and editing comic books for his cousin-in-law's company since he was a teenager. As a publisher, Martin Goodman practiced the most basic principle of business: find the most popular trend, or whatever is making someone else the most money, and imitate it. That accounts for the content of Atlas Comics in the 1950s. It was the time of the Atlas science fiction and monster comics, inspired by the B movies of that decade. In 1961, when Atlas rebranded it to Marvel Comics, Goodman found the trend that he wanted to jump on next. DC Comics was going through a superhero renaissance and had launched the top-selling Justice League of America. Goodman ordered Stan to create a hero team to compete with them. There were only two problems. One, the Justice League was made up of superheroes from other pre-existing comic books in the DC line. Marvel in 1961 had no other existing superhero comics being published at that time to work with. Where were the members of the imitation Justice League going to come from? Two, Stan Lee wanted out of comics. The solution to the second problem came first. Stan's wife, Joan Bucott Lee, was a former model from England. Everything that happened next followed from her suggestion to Stan. Joan reasoned that if Stan was really going to leave comics, on his way out the door he should just once write a comic book that he himself would like to read. Not a comic book created supposedly to entertain children, but a comic book for himself. The worst thing that could happen, Joan argued, was that Goodman would fire him, and he was going to quit anyway. With Goodman's idea and Stan's new resolve, the stage was almost set. Only one thing was still needed. Enter the artist storyteller. Jack Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg. He was a member of the Greatest Generation, a World War II combat veteran, powerfully motivated to provide for his wife, Roz, and their family. The only things as powerful as Jack's work ethic were his imagination and his vast, explosive talent. At the beginning of the 1960s, his career already was the history of comic books. Jack, with writer Joe Simon, had created Captain America, and Jack had also helped to create entire genres of comics: war comics, western comics, romance comics. Though Marvel was on the ropes commercially in the late 1950s and early 60s, Jack was convinced that he could help to turn the company's fortunes around. He was the most prolific storytelling machine in the business, and his work was all over Marvel's monster books. It was Jack that Stan called upon to help him create essentially something out of nothing, a knockoff of the Justice League of America, where no established superheroes existed. Notice anything similar about these two covers? Stan and Jack could not give Martin Goodman what he asked for. The fact that they came up with something else entirely made all the difference for them and for Marvel. On the surface, there was nothing new about any of these characters. There had already been elastic, stretching heroes. Plastic Man had been a hit for Quality Comics, and at DC, The Flash had a stretchable ally, Elongated Man. Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, had the same powers as they, but the very different personality of a serious, profound, visionary super scientist. Before Wonder Woman, there was a heroine who could go unseen called Invisible Scarlet O'Neil, the predecessor of Susan Storm the Invisible Girl, whom we know today as Susan Richards the Invisible Woman, Reed's wife. Timely Comics had a Human Torch, but he was an android. Stan and Jack's all-new Human Torch actually was human, a teenager, Sue's younger brother, with the same powers as the earlier Torch. And finally, all those giant Atlas monsters were the forerunners of a hero who was a monster. Reed's best friend, Ben Grimm, the Thing, who possessed vast strength but was tragically the prisoner of his own powers, trapped in his mutated, rock-like form. To look at them, they were four very derivative characters. But Stan believed it wasn't the ideas that counted, but what you did with them. Stan and Jack together would do things with these new heroes that no one had ever seen in comics before. Stan took Joan's advice to heart, and he and Jack set out to create a comic book not for preteen boys, but for themselves. They gave their new characters something that had not previously been seen with superheroes: distinctive characterizations. The Justice League of America at that time was a chummy club of superheroes who all got along together and practically spoke with the same voice. Stan and Jack's new characters, given superpowers by exposure to cosmic rays in Reed Richards' failed spaceflight, would quarrel and argue with each other, find fault with each other, and at times barely be able to be in the same room together. Reed lived with a crushing guilt over what he'd done to his best friend and vowed to cure him. The Thing, bitter about his condition and resenting Reed, would at least at the beginning be on the edge of turning on the others. The Torch would taunt the Thing, and they would fight. At first, they didn't even wear costumes. Their hero names were the equivalent of stage names. Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Girl were romantically involved without secret identities. In DC Comics, Lois Lane loved Superman but was constantly trying to learn his secret identity, never figuring out that Superman was standing right next to her as Clark Kent. Susan Storm had her own powers, and she and Reed were a committed couple. And Stan and Jack didn't have the new heroes wear masks or conceal their identities. They were a group of argumentative freaks, banded together to serve and protect mankind. Comic book readers in 1961 had never seen anything like the Fantastic Four. Well, almost never. As each of the four had a precedent, so did the team itself. The nearest thing to the Fantastic Four was something that Jack Kirby had done just a few years earlier at DC Comics. The Challengers of the Unknown first appeared in DC's Showcase number 6 in 1957. They were four daring men: Ace Morgan, a jet pilot; Rocky Davis, an Olympic wrestler; Red Ryan, a circus acrobat; and Prof. Haley, an ocean diver, who survived a plane crash together and decided that they were all living on borrowed time. Dedicating themselves to lives of continued adventure, the Challengers protected mankind from technological, superhuman, magical, and alien threats, and became renowned heroes to the world. In Fantastic Four number 1, readers of Marvel Comics learned the story of Dr. Reed Richards, the world's most brilliant scientist, who was determined to win the space race against the communists. Reed had constructed a new rocket ship with which he planned to overtake the Soviets and wanted his best friend from college, Air Force fighter pilot Ben Grimm, to fly it for him. The physically strong and aggressive Ben was the opposite of the intellectual and profound Reed, but had misgivings about the shielding on the ship. What if it wasn't enough to protect them from the cosmic rays outside of Earth's atmosphere? But Reed's fiancée, Susan Storm, saw the importance of Reed's work and planned to accompany them on the flight. When she implied cowardice on Ben's part, he ignored his trepidation and signed on as pilot. And Sue's younger brother Johnny had been at Sue's side since the loss of their parents and insisted on joining the mission with his sister. The four of them stole onto the launch pad and onto Reed's ship. They lifted off directly into a shower of the fateful cosmic rays, which immediately began to affect them. Desperate for their lives, They turned back and crashed the ship, and like the Challengers, they miraculously survived. Unlike the Challengers, they didn't return to Earth the same as they'd left. Each of them was changed. Sue became invisible and learned that she could become visible again at will. Ben, who had so feared the cosmic rays, mutated into a super-strong creature of living rock and couldn't change back, his shocking new power making him a prisoner in his own body. Reed now possessed the power to stretch his body like rubber and make his mass flow like water. Johnny burst into flames, taking flight as a blazing body like the Human Torch of a generation before. Quick to turn a horrifying situation into something good, Reed proposed that they use their newfound powers, grotesque as they were, for a higher purpose, the defense and service of the human race. He took on the name Mr. Fantastic, the most natural name for the leader of a Fantastic Four. Sue dubbed herself the Invisible Girl. Johnny took up the name of the Human Torch that he read about in comic books, something we'll talk about in further episodes. And Ben, remembering that a shocked Susan had called him some sort of a thing, took that as his new name. And, as Stan's narration said, the world would never again be the same. The first signs of the change in the world were in fictional Central City, where it began with ominous words appearing in the air, and a shadowy figure who fired them from a signal gun. A young woman having tea with a friend suddenly disappeared. A cab driver carried a passenger who wasn't there. A huge customer shopping in a men's clothing store revealed himself to be a monster who rampaged through the streets. A teenage hot rod enthusiast burst into flames and flew away. Then, when missiles were fired to stop the flaming figure, it melted all but the last one. Impossibly long arms caught the last missile and tossed it into the sea, then grabbed the youth when his flames died and pulled him in. The Fantastic Four were together again and ready for their first mission. Nuclear power plants all over the world were disappearing, dragged into the earth by gigantic monsters that answered to a mysterious master. The sensing devices in Reed's lab pinpointed the center of the attacks as Monster Isle, where he and his team would go to investigate. Monster Isle lived up to its name. And in the caverns beneath it lay the underground kingdom of the Mole Man. Mocked and rejected for his grotesque appearance, the Mole Man had fled to the world under the Earth's crust, where an accident took most of his eyesight and he adapted to his surroundings like a human mole. So he became the ruler of the monsters that lived underground. After his mighty creatures wrecked all sources of atomic power on the surface world, the Mole Man would command them to attack the human race that had rejected him for his ugliness. But when the Fantastic Four captured him, the Mole Man detonated his own nuclear device, breaking free and sealing off his empire from the surface world. The Fantastic Four escaped, having saved mankind for the first time, but hardly the last. Both the parallel and the opposite of the Thing, the Mole Man was as bitter as Ben Grimm about his misshapen condition. But the cruelty of the world had darkened his heart and turned him to evil ends. He, like the Fantastic Four themselves, was the beginning of Marvel's new approach to comic book storytelling. He was evil, but had underlying motivations for his actions. He wasn't bad just for the sake of being bad. He was wounded and striking back at the world that had hurt him. This was a rare thing to superhero fans in 1961, but they immediately loved it, And with this historic first issue, the Fantastic Four were on their way. Next time, the adventures of the Fantastic Four continue. Stan Lee makes a bold claim that he and Jack Kirby will begin to prove by reaching into the history of timely comics to create the future. If readers thought Stan and Jack were doing daring things with their new creation, they could tell it to the mariner. Forever Fantastic is a video history of the world's greatest comic magazine. The Fantastic Four is the creation of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and a trademark of Marvel Comics and the Walt Disney Company. If you love the Fantastic Four and the classic history of superhero comics, give this video a like and hit the subscribe button to help the adventures of this channel continue.